Let's take a quick look at the current functionality of Squawker. Right now, what you're looking at is an empty recycler view. There's also an activity over here I can get to, which allows me to follow and unfollow instructors. I'm going to go ahead and follow all of the instructors. Great, let's see the code that makes up this app. There are two packages inside of this app. The first is the following package. This contains all the code for that instructor following screen that you saw before. As you can see here, the following preference activity is simply an activity that contains a following preference fragment. All of those switch preferences that we saw before are set up here. If you're new to preference fragments, I've added some links in the notes to get you started. The other package I want to take a look at is this provider package over here. This contains all of the code for a content provider. Looking at my Gradle build file, you can see that I'm using this schematic library here. And if we go over to the contract, we can see all of these annotations from schematic here. Schematic is a library that allows you to quickly make a simple content provider without writing as much boilerplate code. You're not going to need to modify the content provider, so you don't really need to know how to use schematic. But if you're interested, I've provided some information in the notes on this as well. Let's talk about what the data looks like in Squawker in general. The content provider stores a local cache of Squawk messages, and they're stored in a database that looks like this. The local database will save an ID, author, author key, the actual Squawk message, and the time it was sent for every Squawk on the phone. There's also a single URI for Squawks, and it's a URI for a list of Squawks. It's saved in the variable content URI. Beyond the following and provider package, there's also a main activity and an adapter class. The main activity, seen here, is the main screen for the app. If you take a look at it, you'll see that there's a loader to load up the Squawk messages from the Squawk database. And in onCreate, I'm setting up a recycler view here. Going over to the Squawk adapter, this is the adapter for that recycler view. Scrolling down, we have the method onBindViewHolder, which takes data out of the database and visualizes it as items in the recycler view. And if I run my app again, right now, as I mentioned before, my database is empty, so my loader loads no messages and I have a pretty boring app. But what I can do is in main activity, I actually made some code to insert a couple dummy Squawks, and I went ahead and I pasted that in my onCreate. And if I run my code again, I can see here what a Squawk would look like. I've put this dummy code in the notes so that you can try this yourself. Now, there are a few other subtle things about the starter code that I'd like to point out. When I load the messages from the content provider into the UI, I only load the messages for the instructors who I'm following. Let's see how this works. First of all, when you switch who you're following on this screen, you're changing the preferences in a preference fragment. That means that every time that I flip a switch here, a value in the shared preferences is changed. This means that every time I flip a switch here, a value in the shared preferences file is changed. Specifically, the preference I change has the key underscore and then the instructor's name. Now this key is important because it also matches a key stored in my Squawk content provider database. And that's in this author key column here. So, the flow to determine what Squawks to show looks like this. I look at the shared preferences file, which is set by flipping switches on that following preference fragment. I then use the values from the shared preferences file in a method called createSelectionForCurrentFollowers. This method generates a SQLite statement which only selects the rows for the instructors I'm following. Looking at my content provider, this select statement would do something like this. It would only select the row for Cezanne because I'm only following Cezanne and Lila. That select statement is used by the cursor loader in main activity. The end result of all of this is that if I go to my following screen and I deselect Lila, then I won't see any of the Squawks from Lila. But if I go back to my following screen and I select her, then I do see my Squawks. There are a few other things I'd like to point out in the adapter as well. This here is a bunch of logic about how to display the date. The logic of that if statement boils down to this. If the Squawk was made within the last hour, the number of minutes is shown. If the Squawk was made in the last day, but not the last hour, the number of hours since the Squawk was made is shown. Finally, if the Squawk was made more than a day ago, we'll show the day and then 3 letters for the month. Below this date logic, we have this code here, which just appends a dot to the date string. That dot is purely for a visual flourish. And then down here, we have a case switch statement, the purpose of which is to display the correct instructor profile picture. Now, for social media sites with millions of changing users, it makes sense to download and cache user profile pictures when you download messages. After all, you wouldn't want to, and you might not be able to, ship an app with millions of images for everybody's profile picture. But for our purposes, squawks come from a fixed number of power users, so I've elected to have their images in the drawable folder of the app. Okay, I've given you a lot of information about this app, so what I want you to do right now is to download the code and then poke around for a bit. Once you feel confident that you know what the app's doing, go ahead and answer the next question.